the Marx Brothers, which is sort of being dragged on stage playing She Loves You when we've got, asthma and tuberculosis, and when we're 50.
One of the bands John Lennon hated most was a group everyone else loved, and his takedown of them was brutal. While the world saw a hero of love, a storm was brewing in his mind against other artists. He declared war on their music. These weren't small disagreements. They were epic battles that rocked the music industry. Tune in to discover the shocking list of his greatest musical enemies. 1. The Rolling Stones. Perhaps no other relationship in rock history is as famous as the one between the Beatles and the Rolling Stones. They were seen as two sides of the same coin. The Beatles were the lovable pop stars, and the Stones were the dangerous bad boys. In reality, the members were mostly friends, but John Lennon never shied away from a little friendly competition, and he often accused the Stones of being nothing more than copycats. He respected them as musicians, but he never let them forget who he thought was leading the charge. To Lennon, the Beatles were the innovators, the trailblazers, and the Rolling Stones were always just a few steps behind, trying to catch up. He saw it as his band setting the trends, and the Stones following them. This was a point he made over and over again throughout his entire life. In his famous 1970 interview with Rolling Stone magazine, Lennon laid his feelings out for everyone to see. "I think our performing was better than theirs," he said bluntly. He went on to say that the Stones did everything we did 6 months later. This wasn't just a random comment, it was a deeply held belief. He saw a clear pattern. When the Beatles released their groundbreaking psychedelic album, Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, it wasn't long before the Rolling Stones came out with their own psychedelic album, Their Satanic Majesty's Request. Many people at the time saw the Stones album as a direct and less successful answer to Sgt. Pepper. Lennon certainly saw it that way. He felt that while the Beatles were genuinely exploring new sounds and ideas in the studio, the Stones were just trying to keep up with the latest fashion. He saw their efforts as a reaction to what the Beatles were doing, not as true, original creation. This feeling went beyond just the music. When the Beatles became interested in Eastern spirituality and traveled to India to study with the Maharishi, it suddenly seemed like Mick Jagger was also interested in the same things. From Lennon's point of view, it was another example of the Stones following in their footsteps. It's important to remember that these two bands were actually friends. In their very early days, John Lennon and Paul McCartney even wrote a song for the Stones to record, "I Wanna Be Your Man," which became their first big hit. They would hang out in the same London clubs and respect each other's work on some level. But this friendship is what makes Lennon's comments so interesting. It wasn't pure hatred. It was more like the teasing and rivalry between two brothers. Lennon was like the proud older brother who was annoyed that his younger brother was always borrowing his clothes. He was confident, even a bit arrogant, about the Beatles' place in the world. He truly believed they were the creative engine of the 1960s, and he found it amusing and a little bit irritating to watch the Stones constantly trying to recreate their magic. For John, the rivalry wasn't about who was better, because in his mind, that question was already answered. The Beatles were first, and the Stones came second. While he viewed the Stones as gritty followers, he disliked another hugely popular band for being the exact opposite, far too clean and polished for his taste. 2. The Beach Boys.
Did you do any surfing while you were there? Is this possible?
Well, we got up at 6:30 every morning and got in about 2.
It's one of the most celebrated stories in pop music, the friendly rivalry between the Beach Boys and the Beatles in the mid-1960s. Paul McCartney has spent decades talking about how the Beach Boys' incredible album Pet Sounds was a major inspiration for Sgt. Pepper. He heard the beautiful, complex arrangements and the sad, emotional songs and was blown away by their artistry. But John Lennon did not share his bandmates' enthusiasm. While he could respect the skill it took to create their rich vocal harmonies, he was mostly unimpressed by the Beach Boys. He found their overall sound to be too perfect, too shiny, and too far removed from the raw, gutsy rock and roll that he truly loved. He thought their music lacked the edge and the danger that he believed was essential to the spirit of rock. Lennon's taste in music was formed by the raw energy of early American rockers like Chuck Berry, Little Richard, and Elvis Presley. He loved music that you could feel in your gut. It was supposed to be simple, powerful, and a little bit messy. The Beach Boys, especially under the direction of their genius leader Brian Wilson, were the opposite of that. Their music was incredibly detailed and carefully constructed, with layers upon layers of voices and instruments. It was more like a beautiful, polished sculpture than a raw piece of rock. Lennon heard this perfection and found it boring. He didn't want to hear perfectly blended harmonies about surfing and driving cars. He wanted to hear the scream of a real human voice and the crunch of a loud guitar. He saw their music as too clean, too safe, and ultimately not for him. This is why he always pushed back against the idea that Sgt. Pepper was the Beatles' answer to Pet Sounds. That story made it sound like the Beatles were in a competition with the Beach Boys, and Lennon didn't see them as being on the same level. He was proud of the work the Beatles were doing and felt that they were on their own unique journey. He didn't want their masterpiece to be seen as a reaction to anyone else's record. By dismissing the influence of Pet Sounds on his own work, he was also dismissing the importance of the Beach Boys themselves. It was his way of saying that what they were doing was fine, but it wasn't in the same league as the Beatles. He didn't feel the same creative spark or deep emotion in their music that his partner Paul did. Even the subject of their songs felt worlds away from Lennon's own life and art. While the Beach Boys sang about an idealized California dream, John was writing about his own loneliness in Nowhere Man, or the complicated feelings of his childhood in Strawberry Fields Forever. Even the sadness on Pet Sounds felt different to him. It was a gentle, almost sweet kind of melancholy. Lennon's sadness was often sharper, more bitter, and more direct. In the end, Lennon's dislike for the Beach Boys came down to a fundamental difference in what he thought rock and roll should be. For him, it was about raw feeling, not perfect production. The Beach Boys were simply too nice and too neat for his taste. He disliked the Beach Boys' clean sound, but he also grew to hate a band that went in the other direction, with a heavy and dramatic style he found ridiculous. 3. The Bee Gees.
I think this decade is the decade that fashion forgot, because everybody's going back to the 70s and wearing the same clothes again.
In the late 1970s, John Lennon had stepped away from being a rock star. He was living a quiet life in New York City, raising his son Sean and finding peace away from the madness of fame. But while he was at home, a new kind of music was taking over the entire world. It was called disco, and it was playing on every radio station and in every dance club. At the very top of this flashy new wave were the Bee Gees, a trio of brothers with incredibly high singing voices. Their look, with white suits and gold chains, and their sound, a steady dance beat, defined the era. For John, a man whose entire musical life was built on the raw, honest energy of early rock and roll, this was not just a new trend. It was a movement that he felt was plastic and fake, and he hated it from the bottom of his soul. Lennon fell in love with music because of its power and its truth. His heroes were artists like Little Richard and Elvis Presley, who sang with a wild energy that felt real and exciting. He believed songs should come from the gut, telling stories about real life with simple, strong chords. The music of the Bee Gees felt like the exact opposite. Their songs were created with countless hours of studio tricks to make them sound perfect and smooth. They layered their high-pitched falsetto voices over and over again, creating a sound that no one could ever make live on a stage by themselves. The beat was always the same steady thump, designed by producers to make people dance, not to make them feel anything deep. To Lennon, this was not passion. It was a product, like a can of soda pop. It was slick, shiny, and ultimately empty of any real human emotion. This feeling was so strong that he famously told an interviewer he would rather be dead than be in the Bee Gees, because for him, making music without soul was not really living at all. The final straw, and the thing that cemented his hatred, was a bizarre and terrible movie that came out in 1978. The film was called Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, and it starred the Bee Gees. The movie took the most famous and creative album the Beatles ever made and turned its songs into cheesy disco numbers. For Lennon, this was a deep and personal insult. He had poured his creative spirit into that album, changing music forever. His hatred for this kind of fake music was absolute. But he also had no time for rock bands that took themselves too seriously, acting like overly dramatic kings. 4. Queen.
I think it's the same as the variety content that we have on the album. We try and put that across on stage. So, I mean, each song that we do.
If there was one band that stood for everything John Lennon had grown to dislike about rock music in the 1970s, it was Queen. Their sound was a mix of hard rock, pop, and classical opera, full of dramatic changes and incredibly complex arrangements. This was the exact opposite of the simple, direct, and emotionally honest rock and roll that John Lennon loved and created throughout his career. While millions of fans were captivated by Queen's unique and theatrical style, Lennon was not one of them. According to those close to him during the last years of his life, he found their music to be over-the-top, ridiculously produced, and pompous. He simply didn't get it, and he had no interest in trying to. To understand why Lennon disliked Queen, you have to understand what he valued in music. From his earliest days with the Beatles, he was focused on writing songs that came from the heart. Even in the band's most experimental phase, the songs were still built around a core idea or a real feeling. Lennon wanted music to be a gut-level experience, something you felt deep inside you. Queen's music was more of a head-level experience. It was brilliantly clever and technically amazing, but for Lennon, it lacked soul. A song like their masterpiece, Bohemian Rhapsody, was a stunning piece of musical engineering, with its different sections and dozens of vocal overdubs. But Lennon would have likely heard it as a joke, a kind of musical comedy that had nothing to do with real human emotion. He wanted a song to punch you in the gut, not impress you with how smart it was. The contrast between Queen's music and Lennon's own work in the late 1970s could not be more clear. His final album, Double Fantasy, was a collection of straightforward songs about his life as a 40-year-old man. He sang about loving his wife, watching his son grow up, and starting over. The songs were direct, personal, and easy to understand. Queen, at the same time, was singing grand stories about fantasy worlds and putting on massive theatrical concerts. Their music was about creating a spectacle. Lennon had done the spectacle thing with the Beatles and had left it behind. He now believed that the most powerful thing a musician could do was tell the truth, simply and honestly. Queen's music, with its layers of fantasy and drama, felt like the opposite of telling the truth. It's also easy to imagine what Lennon would have thought of Queen's iconic frontman, Freddie Mercury. Mercury was a masterful performer, a true showman who could command a stadium of 80,000 people. But Lennon, who grew up idolizing the raw, untamed energy of performers like Little Richard, would have likely seen Mercury's style as too rehearsed and too theatrical. He would have seen the costumes and the dramatic poses as a kind of performance art, not the raw expression of rock and roll. To John Lennon, Queen was like a Broadway musical, pretending to be a rock band. He saw their music as bloated, pretentious, and missing the simple, rebellious heart that he believed was the whole point of rock and roll in the first place. His dislike for Queen's structured theatrics was matched only by his boredom with an entire music scene that had no structure at all. 5. The Grateful Dead.
I would play something that would shade, I could easily shade the passage that we were playing just by a nuance.
John Lennon's dislike for the Grateful Dead was part of his much larger dislike for the entire psychedelic music scene that came out of San Francisco in the late 1960s. While the rest of the world was fascinated by the Summer of Love and the Flower Power movement, Lennon was completely unimpressed. He saw the whole thing as lazy and unfocused, and the Grateful Dead were the kings of that scene. Their concerts were famous for their long, rambling, and improvised jams. For their dedicated fans, known as Deadheads, these long musical explorations were a spiritual journey. For John Lennon, they were just plain boring. He found their music to be undisciplined, self-indulgent, and a complete waste of time. It's interesting that Lennon felt this way, because the Beatles were pioneers of psychedelic music themselves. Albums like Revolver and Sgt. Pepper opened the world's mind to new sounds and possibilities. But the Beatles' version of psychedelia was very different from the Grateful Dead's. The Beatles' psychedelic songs were carefully put together in the recording studio. They were tight, structured, and full of clever production tricks. A song like Strawberry Fields Forever is a perfect example. It's strange and dreamlike, but it's still a well-crafted 3-minute pop song. It has a beginning, a middle, and an end. The Grateful Dead's approach was the total opposite. Their music was all about freedom, looseness, and letting the song go wherever it wanted to go, often for 20 or 30 minutes at a time. Lennon, a master of writing concise and catchy pop songs, had no patience for this. He likely heard their jams as a bunch of musicians noodling around on their instruments with no real purpose or direction. In his 1970 interview with Rolling Stone, Lennon didn't hold back his feelings about the San Francisco movement.
And now your hosts for this evening, the Rolling Stones.
"I just couldn't get into that scene at all," he said, dismissing the entire culture. He saw the hippies of Haight-Ashbury not as revolutionaries, but as lazy people who were not serious about their art. He was a working-class guy from Liverpool who had worked incredibly hard to become a professional musician. He was a disciplined artist who believed in practicing, writing, and perfecting his craft. When he looked at a band like the Grateful Dead, he probably saw a bunch of amateurs who were more interested in hanging out than in writing great songs. The whole idea of a jam band was against everything he believed in as a songwriter. There was also likely a difference in how he viewed the role of substances in music. The Beatles' experiences with LSD had led them to create highly imaginative and focused music in the studio. It was a tool they used to unlock new ideas. Lennon seemed to feel that the San Francisco bands used substances as an excuse to be lazy and unfocused. He saw their long, wandering jams as the sound of people who were too stoned to write a proper song. He believed that discipline and hard work were what turned a good idea into a great piece of art. From his point of view, the Grateful Dead and bands like them were skipping the hard work part. For John Lennon, who built his legacy on perfectly crafted songs, the unstructured and endless jamming of the Grateful Dead was the very definition of bad music. These feuds paint a picture of a man far more complicated than the simple myth. His genius was tied to his anger, and his famous calls for peace came from a man who was never, ever afraid of a fight. What do these rivalries tell us about the real John Lennon? Like and subscribe for more.